So variables are really useful, but you didn't get to see the whole power of the variables until we actually talk about operators, and that's what this video is about. So let's go to talking about operators and doing a lot more complicated examples. So for this example, we're going to start on the operators tab, which we used very, very briefly in the variables video, but today we're actually going to talk about it in much more detail. Let's look at the shape of them first, because half of the operators are oval and half of them are diamonds, and then there's another bunch of ovals down there. The ovals mean that they output another thing that could be a variable. The diamonds, if you remember from the control tab, there are little squares, or diamonds rather, in here that say if and then a diamond, or if, diamond, else, repeat until diamond. Those tell you that they output something about logic. So we'll talk about those second. So let's do an example of using these round operators. Let's do a real quick example. How about the idea of asking the user for two different numbers and you can add them together, sort of a calculator. So we're going to go over here. Oops, no, we're going to go to the sensing tab. And we're going to say, instead of what's your name, we're going to say, please give me a number and wait. And I'm going to make two script variables. I'm going to start them off, call them A and B. And I'm going to set A to the answer of whatever the user gave us. And then we're going to ask for another number. Please give me a second number. And we'll set B to the answer of that. Now you notice we're using that same little answer thing twice in a row, but it belongs to the one just before it where it says ask, please give me a number and wait. It will not give you this exact same number. It's only giving you the number of whatever the user just gave you. And now we're going to tell the user what the answer of adding those two together is. So instead of saying hello, we're going to say back to the user A plus B. So we'll give a little demo of that. By the way, it doesn't have a control like when I click a flag or anything, but if I just click on it, it will actually activate. So over here, please give me a number. 2. Please give me a second number. 3. So let's hope it says 5. There you go. So that worked really well, and I would just want to make one other quick note to say that we had an example of using string variables where we had ask for the name and then had the name come back, and you can't add string variables together. These mathematical operators are only for numerical variables. There are also some other mathematical operators. There's the modulo operator. You can round the numbers, so if you're not using whole numbers, you can round them up. You can take the square root or a whole bunch of other mathematical functions, log, tangent, absolute value, etc. And you can pick a random number, and we did the random number one in the variables video. Let's skip over the diamond ones for right now, and let's do an example of using the ones that use strings. I want to make an example program that asks the user for a word and then rhymes that word and gives the user back all the words that could possibly rhyme with it. So I'm just going to move this over. And we're going to ask the user for a word. So it says, please give me a word to rhyme. We're going to call it word. So I made a script variable, you'll note, and I can name those script variables the same way that I can name other variables. And I'm going to set that to the word as it comes in. Set word to answer. And now we're going to have to make use of all of these operators. Let's think about what rhyming means. What rhyming means is you take off the first letter of the word or the first syllable. For now, we're just going to assume first letter. Hope the user gives us something simple. And give it other first letters. So if the user, for example, types in dog, then it will give us all the rhyming words for dog. Now I don't have a built-in dictionary, so I'm actually just going to give the user all of the possible words just by looking at all of the different letters in the alphabet. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to need to use the operators tab. So let's start with, I'm going to need to loop through all 26 letters of the alphabet. And there was something we used in control called a for loop, and it's not here. And the way you get it is to import the tools. We're going to grab that, come back to operators and say, we're going to call this, instead of I, we're going to call it letter. Actually, we're going to call it letter number. And we're going to loop from 1 to 26, because there are 26 letters in the alphabet. So before we even get that far, let's make a second variable. Click on the arrow, and then rename it. And I need to store the end of the word. So I call that word end. And I'm going to drag in another for loop. And I'm going to create the end of that word. So let's start first by initializing that word end to be something blank. So word end, it's not going to be 0. It's just going to be blank. And then we're going to loop, we'll leave it at I, from 1 to, let's go to the operators. So we're going to loop from 1 to the end of the word. So how do we do that? We look at the operator length, and we drag the length, and then we're going to drag the length of the word. But we don't actually want to start at the beginning of the word, which is 1. We actually want to start at the second letter in the word. So we're going to start at 2. And then we're going to use another operator in here, and that is the join operator, or actually we could just take the letter operator. What we're going to do is we're going to use the join operator to make letter by letter the end of the word and set that together. So we're going to get into the variables. We're going to reset the variable word end in here, and then we need to letter by letter put together what we already have. So word end, and the letter that we are looking at. Drag that into that little bubble. Instead of letter 1, we're going to take letter I, so the one that we're in on the for loop, and take it out of word. And even without anything else, let's just test that and say, tell the user what the end of the word is. So if I click on this, it asks the user for a word to rhyme. I'm going to type in the word dog, and it should repeat back og. Look at that. We have an entertaining, we have 0 og. It's because when I set this up here, I needed to set it to blank. Try that again. Now it says og. And just for fun, just so you can see what join really does, I'm going to swap the letter of these two. So instead of joining word end to the letter, I'm going to join the letter to the word end, so that you can see what happens. So please give me a word, and I'm going to type in dog, and it's giving me go, because it's putting them in backwards. That can be much more obvious if we click on a much longer word. Hello. And you see it's taking the letters of hello backwards. So let's put them back to the correct order. Take out our say, and now let's work on the rhyming. That'll get us back into the operators tab. So for every possible letter in the alphabet, we can stick that letter onto the front of the word and tell the user the new word. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the new word. And the way we get the new word is we're going to join together the word end. And now we have to bring up a new operator. So we haven't talked about these two down here, the Unicode. Unicode is the value of a particular letter. And you can either use it, it gives you an integer number. And you can either use the integer, or you can take the integer and turn it into a letter. And so what we're going to do is we're going to actually use both of those. We're going to use two operators here. First, we're going to turn it into a letter, but the thing that we're going to turn into a letter is going to be the Unicode of A, which is the beginning of the alphabet, plus whatever index we're on. And then, of course, if we run this, it's going to miss the letter A because we said A plus the index. So we're going to start the index at 0 and end it at 25 instead of 1 to 26. Well, let's run it. Give it the word dog again, and it should give me all of the possible rhymings. Bog, cog. Now, we didn't check to see if it was giving you the same word, dog, and it's giving you a lot of silly words that you can't even pronounce. Fog is a good word. Gog. But it works. So that was a fun introduction to another set of the operators, so the Unicode operators. Let's make a whole new script, and now we're going to talk about how to do the logical operators. So we're going to do that by making a quick game. Okay. So we're going to start a whole new example to talk about the logical operators, just because we're going to build this example up into making a game. Let's just briefly talk about quick ones. This is just a less than, so I could ask my user for something like two numbers and then compare them and tell them which one was greater than the other. This is an equals, a greater than, and then you can do, these ones we're going to come to more in the games, but this is a logical and. That means, you'll notice, let me drag it into the screen, that there are, it's not only is it a diamond shape, but it's got little diamond shapes inside it. So it's assuming that the two things coming into it are not just numbers, but rather logic. So it has to evaluate to either true or false. This has to evaluate to either true or false, and then and will only be true if both sides are true. Or will be true if either side is true, and then not just changes the value. So if you give it not, in fact, we can do that as an example. Not true should report false. And if we switch that out to not false, it'll report true. In fact, we can use those real quick. True and true gives you true. True or false gives you true. And of course, if I give it true and false, it should give me false. So let's actually use those in an example rather than just doing the silly example. There's one thing that is really quick and easy that I should note, that if you're working on code and you want to just quickly comment out an entire section of code, you could actually bring up an if statement, go into the operators and say if false, which will never happen, and then put all of your code inside there. So let's make a quick game where the sprite runs around the world under the user's control. So you use the arrow keys, and it's going to leave a trail behind it. And you try not to run into your own trail. This is sort of like the snake game or the Tron game. It'll give you an example of how to use operators really well. I want to be able to have to go respond to each one of the arrow keys. So there's an up arrow, a down arrow, a right arrow, and a left arrow. I'll move them down here to make them easier to see. We need one more, and that is just sort of restarting the game, because remember, we're going to be drawing. So we'll just do something really quick before we worry about the sensing and the operators and the variables. We'll just get the game itself working. So when you click the flag, I want it to reset, so it should clear the screen, put the pen up, and take the sprite back to the center of the screen, and then put the pen down. And somewhere in there, let's set the color to something more fun than just the default gray. How about if we are a pink sprite? Okay, so now when we go up, the sprite should point up and move up. And we'll just do this for all of them, and then we'll get the sensing. So we point down, point down. That one already is right. So without any sensing and variables to count your score, this should just move around the screen. Except for it's not drawing. Of course, because I didn't initialize it by telling it to put the thing down. So now it's pink, now it should draw around the screen. Okay. So let's bring in a few things to tie together all of these videos. Let's make a variable, we're going to call it our score, and our score is going to be our length. So every time we go somewhere, we increment it. We'll go to variables and we'll say, if you push the arrow key, the score can change by 1. okay? And now let's talk about how to do operators, and we're just, for the purposes of this example, going to pick one direction. And then we could copy that code. Okay, so we're going to make one more variable. I'm going to make a variable called game over. What I'm going to do is when I go right, instead of just blindly moving 10 steps, I actually need to know whether or not things succeeded. So I'm going to move in much smaller increments. In fact, I don't even want to just repeat a fixed number of times. I'm going to repeat a logical something. And I'm going to create another little local variable. Call it we'll try to rename it. Create another local variable. I'm going to name it steps. I'm going to set steps to 0, and then I'm going to repeat, and we're going to bring operators in. And we're going to repeat until either steps is greater than 10 or it's game over. We're going to put an or in there and a comparison. So repeat either until steps is greater than 10 or game is over. Well, you'll note that we never actually set game over to anything, so let's quickly do that. Let's set game over to be false, so that when you start the game, it's never over. And then inside this for loop, we're going to move a very small number of steps. We're going to move 2 steps, and then we're going to check and make sure we're not touching the snake zone trail. We're actually going to check not just touching the pen trails, but check touching the color. And of course we have to get the color exactly as we had it. There we go. So now it checks, are we touching that color? If we are touching that color, we're going to set game over to be true. And at the very end, we're going to increment our score if game over hasn't happened. So if another operator, game over is not true, we'll change our score. So let's see what happens. You see the game over is false. We're going to drive up, which won't do anything, and now we're going to drive right. It drives a little bit more slowly, but it's working, and it is incrementing the score. Cool. It has a small bug. And the bug we have is we forgot to increment the number of steps. So once I hit the right arrow, it's just going to go forever and ever. I don't want set, I want change. Change steps. Let's try that again. Drive up, drive right, and turn around. And now, that didn't work. It didn't seem to touch the pink color. And I think the problem is that these two pinks aren't exactly the same, actually. Let's do something very specific. Let's actually set the pen color to a number instead of setting it to a specific shade. Or, actually, we can leave it at pink. I'm going to leave it at the default red. That will actually work really well. And then we're going to switch this touching block to just say, is it touching the default red? It should work. Drive up, drive over, Turn around. This touching color doesn't seem to be working, so let's try something else. Let's actually try touching pen trails. Reset the game. We have a minor bug in our game. When we reset the game, we don't reset the score. Let's fix that. Okay. Reset the game. Drive up for a minute, and now drive right. You'll note that it's touching its pen trail quite right away. Now part of that is because it is touching it right now. So we could drive left, then try to drive right, and it'll say game over. We're not actually doing anything with the game over variable other than setting it to be true, except for it will no longer drive right. There is one sort of strangeness about touching pen trails, and that is only going to come up if we can edit the sprite. So let's go to costumes. Ah, pen. So you can put the pen on the tip or you can put the pen on the middle, and we want to make sure that the pen is on the tip. That's the important thing. So if we do that, we should be able to drive around our world and go left and down. And then as soon as we start touching the pen trail, we stop. We'll leave it at that. We're not going to implement the whole game. It's actually a pretty fun game, but this was just an example of how you can actually use the logical operators. So this is a pretty fun game, and I'll let you go ahead and finish it as an exercise. I do want to note that your exercise in this module will be making a game, and you can't use this game as your game in the exercise. But have fun using operators and variables together because they will give you a lot of power to your program.